And our second story for this edition of the Rolling Stone comes to us most generously from that ever-giving mud hole of Twitter. Specifically, it comes to us from an action and a reaction that happened this past week. The action was provided by Mr. John Miller, who is one of the commentators on the Blaze TV. And if you cast your minds back to the beginning of the month, beginning of April, I did a whole regular On the Stone video where he featured. Because if you remember, also on Twitter at the beginning of April, John Miller gave a very risible opinion today. He said that trans individuals cannot be conservative. Right? Trans individuals, they can have conservative ideas, conservative beliefs, conservative opinions, but they cannot be in essence conservative. And I did a whole video, regular On the Stone video, where we examined that argument. Well, this past week, John Miller gave another risible opinion on Twitter. He's really good at that. He's a talent for that. And this is what he said, quote, "Libertarians are liberals. They disappear when it comes to a church's right to define marriage as being between a man and a woman, only to reappear when someone tries to close our borders and enforce morality, aka laws, against prostitutes and drugs." That's the action. The reaction comes from Brad Palumbo. Brad Palumbo. I think I've mentioned him before here on the channel. He is a millennial writer, mostly for the DC Examiner, the Washington Examiner, but he's gotten some essays published in the Post-Millennial and on Quillette. He's also started writing for Medium. I read his inaugural essay on Medium, which was weird. I'm just going to leave it at that. It was strange. I should also make it pretty clear right now, or just announce it too, so that you kind of know where he's coming from, that Palumbo also identifies as a gay man. Okay, he is as he says, as he identifies himself, he is a gay libertarian conservative, it's in his Twitter bio. So Brad Palumbo responded to John Miller's tweet like this, quote, "This take is incorrect. I, along with every libertarian I know, respect a church's right to define marriage how they want and only perform weddings between man and woman. We just want the government to treat everyone equally." Bollocks. I'm just going to come out and say it right now. That tweet is absolute bollocks. And it's bollocks for two main reasons. The first one comes at the very beginning, and in fact, it's also a reason why part of John Miller's tweet is also bollocks, when they're talking about the right of a church to define marriage how they want. Specifically, again, I'll read what Palumbo says. "I, along with every other libertarian I know, respect a church's right to define marriage how they want." Okay? That's the first major problem, because guess what? Churches do not have the right to define marriage how they want. Now, you might have thought so. You might have thought that that was one of the big fights in the battle for marriage, 5, 6, 7 years ago. Can churches define marriage how they want? But this is part of the problem when our society has devolved to the point where we can only think of issues in terms of rights and in no other way. Because as important as rights are, as necessary as they are, rights are not the end-all and be-all. There are other things in the world, other things that we need besides just rights. Okay, now that's a risible position in and of itself. But that's also partially a topic for another time, so I will concentrate here. Churches do not have the right to define marriage how they want. Why? Because churches are not their own boss. If you are a Christian church of any persuasion or any denomination, then what you are implying, in the very word, by proclaiming yourself as Christian, you are saying that you are not the boss. You are saying that you are beholden to and you owe obedience to God, right? You wouldn't be in business. You wouldn't exist if there was no God. That's the first thing. Now, as Christians, we also believe, as a Christian denomination, you also believe, or are supposed to believe, that there is a certain way that people are supposed to conduct themselves. You believe also, more importantly, that there are certain things that people are supposed to believe. And we find these beliefs, if you are a Protestant denomination, in the Bible. If you are an Orthodox church, Russian or Greek, or if you are a Catholic church, if you are part of the Universal Catholic Church, then it's the Bible and its sacred tradition, what's called sacred tradition, which is the oral tradition that has been handed down to us from the time of the apostles. Okay, I'm not going to get into all the theological differences between them, but there you go. For Protestants, the truth is found in the Bible. Catholics, Orthodox Christians, it's found in the Bible and sacred tradition. What this means, okay? And now, here's another important point. The Bible and sacred tradition, they are inerrant. They cannot be wrong. There can't be any deliberate lies in them. There can't be any omissions in them. There can't be any mistakes in them. Because these are the things that God has left to us. Okay, this is what all Christians believe. These are the things that God has left to us so that we can know His will, so that we can follow the path that Jesus said we should follow for our salvation, right? Because that's the whole story of Christianity, salvation. In a nutshell, that's it. If man did not need salvation, there would be no need for Christianity. That's the plain, simple truth of that, okay? So, the Bible and sacred tradition, they can't be wrong. Because if they were wrong, then we get into problems. Either God's a liar, meaning He's not God, because that would mean that He's not perfect, and He's not all good, or there is no God, or, your particular denomination is not true. It's got to be one of these explanations. So, churches, they don't have the right to define marriage however they want. Their job is not to define. Their job is simply to proclaim and defend and promulgate the truth. The truth that is preached in the Bible and or sacred tradition. That's it. And the uncomfortable fact is that the Bible has pretty clearly said what marriage is. It's between a man and a woman. Whether you look at Genesis or Leviticus or the Gospels or Paul's letters to the Corinthians or Peter's letters or the letter of St. Jude that is also which is in the New Testament. Again and again and again and again and again ad nauseum you hear that marriage is between a man and a woman. That's just it. And I know some progressive Christians, some people who claim to be Christian but who are not Orthodox Christians by their own admittance, have tried to make arguments about, well, really, that was really, there are loopholes here, so it's much broader than just a man and a woman. I have not read one of those arguments that has been even halfway convincing. Now again, we can't get into the nitty-gritty of that here, but if you really want to read someone who really breaks it down and explains it very, very well, Google Professor Robert A.J. Gagnon, Gagnon. He's a professor of biblical studies, and he knows his stuff. He knows Greek, he knows Hebrew, he knows Latin, and so he has taken on this issue several times, and he goes back to the original languages. Like, he goes back to the original Greek for the New Testament. He goes back to the original Hebrew for the Old Testament. He goes to the Latin Vulgate, which was the first translation of the Bible from Greek into Latin. He goes and he shows, no, they used this word here. This word means this, which means A, B, C, and D. And since, again, the Bible is supposed to be the inerrant word of God, that word was specifically chosen by the writer who was inspired by God to use that particular word in that particular place. Again, if you are a Christian and you believe this. So that is the first thing. That's the first thing. Churches don't have a right to define what marriage is or isn't. Their obligation is to proclaim what marriage is, no matter if that's a popular opinion or not. Now, this is important, even if you're not religious, or even if you're religious but you're not a Christian, okay? Because you might be thinking, if one of those two apply to you, it's like, well, you know, what does it matter to me? This is between Christians and Christian denominations, and that doesn't apply to me. What Brad Palumbo is insinuating here in his tweet, and honestly what John Miller is insinuating in his original tweet when he said a church's right to define marriage, they are both assuming a nihilistic society. A nihilistic society where the truth is simply determined by popular vote or by the will to power. Whoever has the biggest stick gets to determine what the truth is. Because remember gang, it goes back to the principle of non-contradiction, which we've talked about before here on the channel. A thing cannot be true and not true at the same time. You can't have definition A of marriage and then definition B of marriage that contradict each other, and they can't both be true at the same time. Either they're both false and the truth is some third option, or one is true and the other is false. They both can't be true. And if the truth is subjective and nihilistic with something as important as marriage, because again, remember, marriage is pretty important. Marriage is the bond that makes families. And as I just talked about in our regular On the Stone video for this week, family is still the cornerstone of society. We talked all about that on our regular On the Stone episode for this past week, and you can watch it after this one. So the truth is never relative. Truth is never relative. It is always the truth. And it is especially never relative when it comes to something important like marriage and family, which is the cornerstone and the bedrock of civilizations itself, really the center of the world when you get right down to it. Because one thing that we all have in common besides our shared universal human nature is that we all came from a family. Doesn't mean that we all came from good families. Doesn't mean that we all had happy childhoods. But we all came from a family of some sort. There was a unit, however brief or, however broken. There was father, mother, and child. So, there's that point. Because if you accept Palumbo's logic here, then what you accept is a nihilistic society, where the only thing that matters is the will to power, which is actually very, very ironic, because a couple of months ago, when the state of Utah changed its laws so that polygamy now is simply a misdemeanor, David Marcus over at the Federalist wrote a piece about that decision in Utah, about that change in Utah's law, and said, this was absolutely predictable because of the Supreme Court's redefining marriage to include gay pairs. It was perfectly logical now that polygamy would be one of the things that is encore to be legalized next. And Brad Palumbo wrote a furious, quote-unquote, rebuttal to David Marcus's opinion piece in the Washington Examiner, where the funny thing was he didn't really so much dispute Marcus's arguments. He simply said that they were ridiculous, and then he pulled out a poll, which says that 80% of Americans still oppose polygamy, so there's absolutely no problem here. Polygamy will never, ever, 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 ever be legalized. Let's leave out the inconvenient fact that in 1990, the vast majority of the American population was also set against redefining marriage to include gay pairs. And then guess what? Public opinion changed and we are where we are today. Let's forget about that. If Brad Palumbo is right here in this tweet, that a church's right to define marriage how they want, then why shouldn't polygamy be allowable? Why shouldn't incest be allowable? Why shouldn't every church be able to define marriage however they want to include polygamy and incest, in child marriages, or however they want? Okay? Because according to Brad Palumbo, for all the talk about how it's ridiculous that, gay marriage would have opened up the doors for everything else to be legalized, he himself is saying so right here in this tweet. Because every church has the right to define marriage how they want. That's the first point. The second point, which is just as ridiculous, when he says, we just want the government to treat everyone equally. This is one of the old canards, the old chestnut that came, again, from the marriage battles, where the line was, we just want the government to treat everyone equally. We just want the government to treat everyone equally. Every individual person should be treated equally under the law. In fact, that's why the law is there. However, that was never the issue. The issue, of course, was about whether institutions and arrangements are equal. First of all, it was about institutions. What is the purpose of marriage? Is it just about adults, or is it about children? And then secondly, it was about, are arrangements equal? Because again, now we're not talking about, just treating Mo, Larry, and Curly equally under the law. We're saying that all of the arrangements that they make in their personal lives are equal. So Larry is living with 3 women and 1 other guy, and they all want to get married together, have a group marriage. That's Larry. Mo is over here with his wife, and Curly over here has, a boyfriend. A boyfriend and a dog, maybe. Just a boyfriend. We don't want to make this too weird. And they want to get married too. Okay? Now, are all those different arrangements equal? Are they equal in worth? Are they equal intrinsically? No, they're not. Because, again, as I explained in our regular On the Stone video this past week, sex is primarily about children. And that's a very risible position to take these days because of the sexual revolution and everything. But that's the only reason why sex exists in the first place. And I made this point over on my regular video, and I'll make it again. If sex was not about children, if children were not a natural result of sex, then there would be absolutely no reason at all for people to practice quote-unquote safe sex, because there wouldn't be anything that we would need to be quote-unquote protected from, right? When people practice safe sex, they are implicitly acknowledging that sex is about children. They just go together, as I said, like Roger and Hammerstein. So only the arrangement that actually recognizes that recognizes that bond of man and woman for the purpose of uniting, for the purpose of communion, for the purpose of producing children. That's what marriage is. That is the norm, if I can actually use the N-word here. And so all other arrangements are not equal to that. And so they shouldn't be treated the same. They shouldn't be treated the same. Not at all. Let me just give a rough analogy, okay? It's like a general and a private, right? They're both human beings, so they both are morally equal, and the laws will treat them equally. But the government and society does not treat them equally because they are different things. One is a general and one is a private. One was a leader, one was not. Okay? That's a rough analogy again, but it really does sort of get to the point of what I am trying to say, that while individuals, persons, must be treated equally by the law for it to be a just law, organizations, institutions, and arrangements, that's what I want to say, arrangements cannot be treated the same. They cannot be treated equally. Things that are not marriage cannot be treated as if they were marriage. To do so would be fundamentally unjust, because as Aristotle said in his Ethics, I believe, the highest form of injustice is the treating of different things as if they were the same. It's fundamentally unjust. It's the greatest sort of injustice, because you're basically lying. You are saying that A equals B, even though the two are completely different. That is that's the big my big take on Brad Palumbo's tweet, and that is story number 2.